to welcome to the station, please feel free to do so. They are social media influencers and animal rights activists who have over 23 million views on their YouTube channel, plus millions more on Instagram and Facebook. For the last 2 years, they have organised international activism tours to educate and inspire vegans to be active. I think that deserves a little round of applause. They have spoken at vegan and animal rights events and conferences all over the world. Make as much noise as you possibly can for that vegan couple, Natasha and Luca!
Hello. That vegan couple in 1991.
10 years old.
Admittedly, we weren't a couple back then.
I did have a crush on you though.
Yeah, but I thought he was too tall.
28 years later, and here we are talking to you lovely people at the UK Vegan Campout.
What a journey it's been. When Jordan invited us to speak here today, in addition to the vegan and animal rights topics that we usually talk about, he also asked us to speak a little more about us, our story, how we ended up here, our channel and achievements, and a little more behind the scenes of that vegan couple.
So we guess we start way back in primary school, and there was always a connection and spark between us.
I've always been terrible at math. And when our teacher sat me away from my friends and sat me next to Luca for our daily math test, kind-hearted Luca would move his hand away from his paper and let me copy his test. It didn't last long because my grades went from about 3 out of 20 to a near-perfect score overnight, so I was clearly copied.
If someone told me back then that I was letting my future wife copy my math tests, I wouldn't have believed it.
In fact, imagine if someone told us back then that in the future we'd be spending many years together, again, sitting side by side, working together, but this time for a common cause, animal rights and liberation.
Every day after math class, we had a debating class. So I watched Natasha go from feeling crushed in a soul-destroying math test to thriving as a confident pocket rocket debater who always had a response for her opponents. Sound familiar, anyone? Imagine if I knew back then that one day I'd be filming this woman doing outreach on the streets, defending animals' lives against an endless onslaught of carnist objections.
Fast forward to 1996. At age 16, our paths crossed again at a month-long Toastmasters International public speaking competition. There was a thunderbolt moment, like in the movies, and yeah, that was at age 16.
Then one day, when Natasha was on tea duty during a break and offered me a biscuit, I unfortunately missed the opportunity to ask her out on a date. But I redeemed myself 2 years later at age 18 when I finally made a move at a party.
It only took him 2 years. Long story short, we got married in 2004. Luca worked in banking and training, again, good with numbers and people. I worked initially as a radio journalist and later in corporate communications, again, gift of the gab. A few years later, we had a quarter-life crisis, which could have potentially broken us up. We ended up leaving our corporate careers, packing up our lives and taking a 1-year sabbatical in 2008 to get ourselves and each other back on track.
After that, we did many different things with our lives in many different countries. We did volunteer work in Thailand with street kids, disabled adults, blind children and orphan babies. We taught yoga in India and ran vegan yoga retreats all around the world. We were kitchen hands at a retreat centre in Spain, and at one point we even lived as semi-hermits in the Andes. And there were many more experiences over the years that led us to April 2014.
That's when we nervously filmed our very first YouTube video in our backyard. So back then we recorded on a very old laptop, was balancing on a shoebox, we had noisy planes flying overhead, and we were arguing with each other about the script and how it should be delivered, not knowing anybody would even watch the video.
We never would have imagined that 5 years later we'd have more than 23 million views on our YouTube channel, millions more on Facebook and Instagram, run international activism tours, and be invited to speak at international events.
What we also never imagined was just how hard it would be to make this online and offline partnership work. People often ask us about that vegan couple behind the scenes. What is it like? Well, the truth is there are certainly many ups and downs. It can be stressful and testing working together 24/7, 365 for the past 11 years, especially since putting our life online for the past 5 years.
A lot of people ask us, how do we do it? Well, it's definitely a team effort, and there are two things that we think that have helped us keep going. Number one, we worked hard at optimizing and harmonizing our relationship years ago. And what we mean by this is we sorted out our stuff so that we could get focused on the bigger mission.
Which brings us to point number 2. We stay focused on the bigger mission, animal liberation. We live and breathe it. The only reason we got on social media was to help the vegan and animal rights movements. The only reason we're here today is to educate and inspire people in some way to help animals.
So when the pressure is on, when the haters fill our inbox, when our life is under a microscope, when the criticism is intense, when we bicker off camera about scripts and editing, when we feel like colleagues more than husband and wife, we remember it's all for them.
We're prepared to work around whatever we need to because any hardships that we experience are absolutely nothing compared to what trillions of animals experience. For many years now, our tagline has been, going vegan is not the most we can do, it's the least we can do. And what we mean by that is not breeding, mutilating, sexually assaulting and slitting the throats of animals unnecessarily is literally the least we can do.
Now, although this seems like the most basic idea to us now, it wasn't always like this. There's nothing I loved more than cooking up a barbecue. I used to pride myself on eating a whole roast chicken on my work lunch break. All I wanted for my 30th birthday was to celebrate with a spit-roasted lamb in the backyard. We also used to wear leather, including soft-skin leather jackets made from baby deer, wool coats, suits and thermals. We had down-filled sleeping bags, zoo memberships, and on holiday enjoyed horse and elephant riding.
That's the zoo memberships, slow clicker. And that's us riding animals. This is me on my 16th birthday. I remember having that photo taken standing in the kitchen with my dad, and we're standing over a whole cooked, decorated pig. I had a knife in one hand and a smile on my face. And that was me, sweet 16. I used to say salad and fruit were bird food. Real food for humans had to have meat. In fact, I used to work at the butcher's in a supermarket and packaged dismembered body parts.
And I used to flip burgers at McDonald's as a teenager. The first change to our diet of any kind came around 2006 when we started to buy organic meat and milk and cage-free eggs. We bought the humane lie nice and good. This was because of a book Natasha reviewed when she worked as a radio journalist. It was all about the health benefits of organic food. And boy did we feel ethical paying top dollar for yuppie meat from a butcher with posters of grass-fed cows.
The first time I met a vegetarian was in 2008. I worked with a lovely lady who grew up on a farm. And one day we went out for lunch and I ordered a sausage roll. And she said to me, if you knew what happened to the animals for them to end up in that sausage roll, you wouldn't want to eat it. Well, I screwed up my face, I turned away and said, no, don't tell me, I don't want to know. And I ate the sausage roll.
A few months later, we remember eating a stack of different meats on a skewer and laughing to each other saying, "Look, we're eating a whole farm." Later that same year, we were on holiday in Turkey and we ganged up with 2 other meat eaters and mocked a teenage girl at our hostel for being vegetarian. She was eating pomegranate fruit for dinner and pouring her heart out about how difficult it was as a vegetarian living with her parents who didn't understand or support her.
We were devouring our lamb kebabs, saying things like we could never give up this taste, and the animals were already dead, so we might as well eat them.
Just 2 months after ganging up and mocking the vegetarian in Turkey, we went to live in an ashram in India for 3 months. And we had to eat a vegetarian diet.
The universe works in mysterious ways. Of course, we feared that we would suffer from protein and iron deficiencies, so we loaded up on eating as much meat as we possibly could in the weeks leading up to going to the ashram.
Early on during our stay in the ashram, we recall complaining with another meat-eating couple about how we all felt lacking in energy due to the anemia we were all no doubt developing.
I so desperately missed eating animal flesh when we first arrived in the ashram that I remember trying to meditate and having visions of dancing lamb chops and sausages going through my mind.
One night, we were shown a film that changed our lives. For the first time ever, we learned the truth about what is done to animals so that we can eat their flesh, and the impact that it has on our health and the environment.
And we were shocked to our core. We weren't on social media back then. We were heavily entrenched in meat-loving culture, and we had never seen or heard anything about animal agriculture before. So there we were, sitting in a hall with about 300 other people, and at the end of that film, there was a rapturous applause from the mainly vegetarian audience. Well, we just sat there, bug-eyed and in shock, and then we looked at each other and dropped an F-bomb.
The strongest emotion we felt in that moment was anger, for 2 reasons. Number 1, how could we have not known this for 28 years? And number 2, now we have to change what we eat. We went back to our room that night and both knew there wasn't even a decision to make. Eating animal flesh was no longer even an option.
So when we returned home to Australia as vegetarians, of course our meat-loving families were totally shocked. And yet the only thing that separated us as vegetarians from our meat-loving families was education. But when my grandmother asked me if we still eat eggs and cheese, I said, well, yes, of course we do. We'd never give up those foods. That would be going too far, and we've already given up enough. In other words, we'd done our part.
Again, a lack of education about the egg and dairy industries kept us ignorant to the truth and kept us consumers of violence. Because we weren't on social media back then, we didn't know that day-old baby male chicks are considered useless to the egg industry, including free-range, cage-free, organic and higher welfare, and so they're either ground up alive in an industrial macerator, gassed to death, or thrown away in garbage bags to suffocate.
We didn't know that newborn baby calves are taken away from their mothers soon after birth so that humans can steal her milk, and the baby males are either killed within a few days or raised for veal and killed within 16 to 20 weeks.
We didn't know that egg-laying hens and milk-producing mother cows are all slaughtered for their flesh anyway once the production of their secretions declines and they're no longer making enough money for the industry and not worth keeping alive.
It wasn't until August 26, 2011 that we watched Gary Yourofsky's Best Speech You'll Ever Hear video on YouTube, that we learned how violent the egg and dairy industries are, and that we were still contributing to the misery and slaughter of billions of animals as vegetarians.
You see, we went vegetarian because we didn't want to kill or exploit animals. So in order to remain morally consistent, we had to be vegan.
After watching that eye-opening speech, again, there wasn't even a decision to make. We both knew that eating any animal products or using and exploiting animals in any way was no longer even an option. We were now vegan. We'll let these pictures speak for us and show what kind of a transformation anyone can make.
Back back to our vegan story in 2011. As soon as we finished watching that speech, we sent an email with the link to everyone in our contacts list, letting them know that we'd just come across this life-changing and life-saving information and that we felt a moral obligation to share it with them. Let's just say we had a mixture of responses, but the main thing we heard was silence. The majority of people did not react or respond at all. That was 8 years ago, and we haven't stopped speaking up for animals since.
Trying to stop the exploitation and violence in some way is what the victims need.
Consider this often used example. You see a man needlessly beating a dog in the street. You have three choices. Choice number one, you could say, hey, that looks like fun, grab a stick and join the man in beating the dog. I'm sure we could all agree that's the morally wrong choice to make. Well, that's like living as a non-vegan and paying someone else to needlessly kill innocent defenceless animals on your behalf. Choice number two, you could choose not to join the man in beating the dog. That's like living vegan. You're simply no longer participating in the exploitation of and violence towards animals. Choice number three, you could choose to take some form of action to try to stop the man beating the dog. I'm sure we could all agree that's the morally right choice to make. So, in order to remain morally consistent, if we think that taking action to stop the needless exploitation and violence towards a dog is the morally right thing to do, then taking action to stop the needless exploitation of and violence towards other animals must also be the right thing to do.
To take this example of the dog, thank you. To take this example of the dog one step further, if I was the victim, if someone had dominated my life, exploited and mutilated my body, and intended to slit my throat and chop my head off, would I be satisfied with people simply not joining in the exploitation and violence? Or would I want people to speak up and try to stop the exploitation and violence? What would you want if you were the victim?
When we put ourselves in the position of the victim, it's very easy to see why being an activist is so important. The challenge remains, however, to get more vegans to become activists. We've noticed that the aversion many vegans have to becoming activists is as strong as the aversion many non-vegans have to becoming vegan.
Perhaps the best example of this is vegans being blocked from vegan Facebook groups for posting animal rights activism content.
In our opinion, the root cause of this aversion is a fear of judgment by others. Many non-active vegans fear judgment from non-vegans, and they don't want to be seen as pushy, annoying, militant, extreme vegans.
We remind non-active vegans that they already demonstrated the courage to withstand judgment from non-vegans when they went vegan. And therefore, all they have to do is draw on that very same courage to become an activist.
We also remind not-active vegans that just as every vegan will tell you that going vegan is the best thing they ever did and they only wish they'd done it sooner, every activist will tell you that becoming an activist is the best thing they ever did and they only wish they'd done it sooner.
As Albert Einstein said, those who have the privilege to know have the duty to act. And as vegans, we all have the privilege to know the truth about how animals are exploited. Therefore, we all have a duty to act.
History has shown us that veganism alone will not be enough to achieve animal rights. Human slavery was not abolished by some members of society simply not owning slaves. It took action by abolitionists.
Women's rights were not won by some members of society simply not being sexist. It took action by women's rights activists.
Civil rights were not won by some members of society simply not being racist. It took action by civil rights activists.
The gay rights that have been won were not won by some members of society simply not being heterosexist. It took action by gay rights activists.
Similarly, animal rights will not be won by some members of society simply not being speciesist or simply being vegan and no longer participating in the exploitation of and violence towards animals. It's going to take action by animal rights activists.
The path to animal liberation is a long one and it is far from over. We cannot get comfortable just because we have more vegan options in our local supermarkets and restaurants. These are great, but they are not indications that animal liberation is near.
The battle is not to make life easier for vegans by having more plant food choices available. The battle is about liberating non-human animals from a tyrannical system of oppression and violence by taking action to enact animal rights into legislation.
Now, there are many different ways to advocate for animals, and there is no one single best way.
Different styles and approaches will appeal to different people, different strokes for different folks, and so we need all of it.
For over 5 years, we have chosen to use social media as our main avenue for activism. But to be honest with you, many years ago, we hated the idea of social media, and we didn't even want to get on Facebook. But two things that changed our mind.
Number one, if one of the first YouTube videos we ever watched turned us vegan, then this is a very powerful tool that clearly works.
And number two, we noticed that everybody were on their devices, watching and scrolling and watching and scrolling. And we said to each other, well, they're watching something, so we might as well get on this thing, and they can watch us and learn about veganism. So we got on social media not because we like it, but because it works.
It's the most effective and efficient tool that we know of that directly reaches the most number of consumers and creates powerful change.
For example, you can have one experience as an activist, such as an outreach conversation, or perhaps you're filming some pigs on a truck, and that experience can just stay with you, or you can upload that content online and potentially reach and influence tens or hundreds or thousands or even millions of other people.
And not only are you reaching consumers, but you're also reaching not active vegans and encouraging them to get active and to create and share content.
Normalising activism within the vegan community is extremely important, even if the oppressors will try to label activists as pushy, annoying, militant and extreme. And we've been called a lot of things over the last 5 years on social media. We often find that people hate us before they love us. And that's mainly because of the response videos we make to non-vegan YouTubers with large audiences. Typically the ones who promote eating a non-vegan diet or tried a vegan diet for a week, etc. People tell us all the time how much they hated us when they first saw our videos, but then they kept hate watching, and now they're vegan and they love us.
Here's an example of a comment left on our Instagram. I used to watch a lot of YouTube videos by Sarah's Day, and your reaction video to her about no longer being vegan was the first I'd ever heard of you guys. I wasn't vegan at that time, and I felt very defensive. A year or so later, I was talking to my best friend about veganism. She'd already been vegan for a little over a year, and I made a comment about her not being one of those crazy vegans. She then felt defensive, of course, because she could relate to those crazy vegans. I pulled up your Sarah's Day reaction video to show her what I was talking about. Yep, I thought you were both extreme crazy vegans. But that was the video that changed everything for me. I hadn't watched it with an open mind the first time, but your words opened my mind the second time. The more I tried to prove to my best friend that it was okay to eat animals, the more I realised it wasn't. My research to refute veganism inspired me to become vegan, and I have been vegan since January.
Our strategy over the years has been to be proactive. We can't wait for someone to maybe one day look into veganism and hope that our videos come up in their search. We take veganism to them. We force the issue by using YouTubers that they love to watch as our Trojan horse.
Because when those YouTubers make a video about how they lost weight eating bacon, our response video will come up in the recommended options. And of course, human beings love drama, so you know people are going to click on a response video.
And that's all it takes. They're in our vegan web. Now we know that a lot of vegans feel helpless trying to change things and feel like anything they do is not enough to stop the horrors that animals endure. We want to remind people that everything you do, every effort you make, does have an impact.
We all have a circle of influence, and it's very important that we each influence it to the best of our abilities. We may each just be a drop in the ocean, but what is an ocean but a multitude of drops? One to change a few to change the many, many to change the world. It all starts with one.
At the beginning of this year, we received an amazing message from a woman in Birmingham. When we read her message, we told her that we would share that story at the UK Vegan Campout in the hope that it helps inspire other people in some way.
The message was, I just have to tell you this. 4 years ago, I watched one of your response videos to Zoella and Tanya Burr. I came, in all honesty, to defend them, and I ended up going vegan. My dad was a big meat eater. We have an Irish family, so you know how they are with their meat, etc. He was severely overweight, and my granddad had already had his first heart attack at the age my dad was then. Anyway, I sat him down and I said, Dad, I found this vegan couple on YouTube and it's changed my life. And I said, please try it. We sat and watched Earthlings together. We cried together. It was the biggest connection as father and daughter we've ever made, to be so in sync. He went vegan overnight and now he's lost 5 stone. You could have quite possibly saved my dad's life. Thank you and Happy New Year.
We continued to message this person and got some more of the story, which further amazed us and put things into perspective. She said,
it's amazing how 2 people sitting in front of a camera on the other side of the world can change so many lives. Not only my dad and I, but my boyfriend, our future children, our friends and colleagues. It's funny, when I first watched that video of yours, I didn't like you both. I thought, who do they think they are, judging everyone? Then day by day, the seed was planted, and it grew. About a week later, I was telling everyone to go vegan. My dad is a builder. He sits in the canteen with a bunch of men eat steak type of men, who quite frankly take the piss out of him. And he's like, I don't give a F-bomb. He sits with his avocado on toast, his vegan butter and milk, etc., while all the men are eating bacon and egg sausage sandwiches, and I'm so proud of him.
She goes on, he really cares about the animals and he isn't afraid to tell people. And for him to do that, just because of me showing him what I learned from you both, shows it's all worth it.
Burr fans hate us?
Yes.
Did we care?
No. Our job is not to be liked. It is to be heard any way possible, to force veganism and animal rights into the mainstream for discussion. More on this in a moment. Okay, we have one more powerful example of how being proactive with the vegan message on social media can achieve incredible results.
Back in 2016, we made a response video to makeup guru Carly Bible. After watching our response video, and that of another vegan YouTuber, Carly made a video for her then audience of 4.2 million subscribers, now over 6 million, explaining why she decided to go vegan, promoting the best speech you will ever hear video, and giving our channel a shout out.
We'll never forget the moment that Carly tagged us on Snapchat and we watched her forcefully throwing a carton of eggs into the bin saying, no more. Her actions resulted in about 60 to 70,000 of her subscribers subscribing to our channel to learn more about veganism.
That was a very good day. So no matter who you are or where you are in the world, always remember that whatever way you advocate for animals is making a difference. Seeds are always planted and eventually they may sprout.
And all the hate comments and criticism is worth it. If we let all the hate messages stop us, we would have left social media after the first week. But that wouldn't have helped the countless number of people who have watched us over the years, or it certainly wouldn't have helped any of the animals.
So we stay focused on what matters and we keep moving forward. Each video upload, each post, each speech, each podcast episode, each workshop, inch by inch, we keep moving forward. And if we all keep moving forward in whatever way we can, together we will achieve animal liberation and create the world we want to see.
But in order for that to happen, we all need to be active or advocate for animals in some way. However you advocate for animals, we strongly recommend posting it on social media. It doesn't have to be YouTube. Facebook and Instagram are also excellent platforms to reach a larger audience on. And keep in mind, you never know which of your posts will take off.
For example, we've uploaded many outreach videos, and yet one video in particular touched the hearts of so many people. The video was called "Vegan Woman Ends Up in Meat Eater's Arms." It was a conversation Natasha had in Portland last year with a young man named Josiah. He made the connection, they ended up hugging and crying.
Now you're going to make me cry, my gosh. So that video has been viewed over 1.5 million times across various platforms. Wherever we're travelling, one of the first things people say to us is, "I saw that conversation you had with the young man, and you started crying, and he was crying, and then I started crying too."
Countless people have commented how that conversation either moved them, made them look into veganism, helped them go vegan, inspired them to get active and join Cubes of Truth, or for others, it restored their hope that people are capable of change.
I also have people telling me that they'll watch that video before going to a Cube of Truth demonstration to get them psyched before doing outreach. I knew that conversation was special at the time, but I never imagined that it would have got the response that it did. Now, if we didn't record that conversation and put it on social media, that magical experience would have only stayed with 2 people, instead of reaching over 1.5 million.
We were once asked what we thought was the worst thing a vegan could say that would not be good for veganism. Our honest answer? The worst thing a vegan could say is nothing at all. As long as your message is about animal liberation and ending speciesism, it doesn't matter how you speak up or take action for animals. Just make sure you do speak up and take action for animals.
Because trillions of animals are relying on us. They are innocent, defenceless, vulnerable beings who don't have a way of fighting for their own rights. We have their lives in our hands, and if we don't help them, they have no chance of escaping hell.
So what can each and every vegan do? Well, there are so many ways that we can advocate for animals, and we always encourage people to utilise their skills, interests and passions in any way that they can.
Some examples of things and jobs that people have veganised include documentaries, books, magazines, speeches, and translating all of those things. Websites, apps, podcasts, social media, virtual summits, conferences, music, art, dance, event planning, festivals, holiday tours, food trucks, cafes, restaurants, meal delivery services. There are vegan doctors, nutritionists, psychologists, politicians, and lawyers. School and university students can write essays, give presentations, have debates on veganism, and organise screenings of vegan documentary films and invite guest speakers, etc.
Social media has popularised grassroots animal rights activism in the last few years. In particular, Anonymous for the Voiceless Cubes of Truth, Save Movement Vigils, and Direct Action Everywhere, or DXE Disruptions. You can look these groups up online and search for a chapter in your area to get involved with if you're not already, and if there isn't a chapter, consider starting one.
Last year and this year, we organised international activism tours, and one of the things we're most passionate about when speaking to audiences is explaining the power of and need for direct action.
Direct action is the form of activism that has the most controversy surrounding it. Direct action, which can be non-violent or violent, has been used by social justice movements throughout history. Movements that have used non-violent direct action have been more successful because most people typically don't want to be involved with violence, and of course with violence, the moral high ground is lost.
Non-violent direct action is also known as civil resistance, which is recognised as a fundamental human right under international law. However, non-violent direct actions are sometimes a form of civil disobedience, which is the active refusal to obey certain laws. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote that one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. Now, there are many different examples of direct action, but to give everybody an idea of what we're talking about, perhaps the most well-known example of direct action in the animal rights movement is when activists disrupt a steakhouse or a supermarket by going in, holding signs and chanting, "It's not food, it's violence."
Many years ago, when we first saw a steakhouse disruption on social media, we turned to each other and said, is this effective, or is this actually counterproductive and hurting the movement? And we said we'd never get involved in direct action.
Never, ever.
However, just as some non-vegans resist veganism due to a lack of education, as vegans, we were resisting direct action due to a lack of education. We were putting ourselves in the position of the diners in the steakhouse and asking ourselves if we'd be influenced to go vegan by the disruption.
However, that is not the purpose of direct action, as we learned when we watched a YouTube video by DXC co-founder Wayne Shang, Social Change. With one-on-one conversations, we're trying to create individual change by planting seeds to influence someone to go vegan. With disruptions, we're not trying to create individual change by trying to influence the individuals nearby to go vegan. The aim of disruptions is to create social change by forcing society's attention to the issue of animal rights and forcing a social debate about animal rights.
It doesn't matter what people are saying about animal rights, we just want them saying something about animal rights. We need to force them to acknowledge the issue, think about the issue, and take a position on the issue. And as Wayne Shang says, we must force the issue because we know we can win the debate.
And by the way, this is essentially what we were doing with those YouTube response videos we spoke about earlier on. We were forcing the topic of veganism and animal rights into the YouTube feed of an unsuspecting audience. One might say we were disrupting their YouTube feeds.
So, how do we know we can win the debate? Because there is no moral justification for needlessly killing a sentient being who doesn't want to die.
And why is it necessary? Yeah. And why is it necessary to disrupt and force the issue? Firstly, because people live very busy lives, so why would they waste their time questioning something that they've been told is normal, natural and necessary by every institution in society, such as family, education, religion, government, industry and the media? So if we wait for people to question carnism and speciesism themselves, animal rights will never be won.
And the second reason why it's necessary to disrupt and force the issue is because most people would prefer to remain willfully ignorant, so they can avoid the discomfort of changing their worldview and lifestyle and continue to hide amongst the knives and the forks.
Disruption also brings to light the negative peace. Negative peace is where there is the appearance of peace, but it is at the expense of others, of the suffering of others. And in this case, that's the animals. And there is also an absence of justice. Disruption brings to light the violence that is hidden in plain sight but goes unquestioned or willfully ignored.
Martin Luther King Jr. wrote that the goal of nonviolent direct action is that it seeks to create such a crisis and foster such a tension that a community which has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. It seeks so to dramatise the issue that it can no longer be ignored.
We're sure we could agree that the issue of animal rights has been ignored by the non-vegan majority for far too long.
One of the best historical examples of how non-violent direct action was used to force social debate and create social change are the sit-ins during the civil rights movement. These really inspire us, and we encourage people to read up about the Greensboro Four to learn how we can effectively use disruptions and civil disobedience in the animal rights movement.
There are many examples about how effective direct action is. One of the most recent and amazing examples is what happened in Australia earlier this year. On the 8th of April, 9 coordinated actions across the country commemorated the one-year anniversary of the release of the animal rights film Dominion. Now, when that film was released in 2018, around 2,000 to 3,000 people marched legally and expectedly in Melbourne to raise awareness. And yet, there was no TV coverage that we know of, only a handful of online articles, and no social debate.
But in April this year, several hundred people, not thousands, were involved in nationwide disruptions and civil disobedience, and the entire country was talking about Dominion. 53,000 new views of the film in the first 48 hours following the disruptions. Incidentally, 500,000 new views since those disruptions. That's national mainstream media stations reported throughout the day. International media picked up the story. The Prime Minister of Australia was talking about the actions. Sure, he called us criminals, but at least it created debate. New laws were being proposed to try to deter activists from taking similar action in the future, which have again created debate. Animal rights activists were even being called terrorists. Basically, these disruptions and civil disobedience caused massive controversy and hence social debate.
That's the difference between legal and expected action versus civil disobedience and unexpected disruptions. Having said this, not all direct action needs to be illegal. There are many legal disruptions, and often even the illegal disruptions will have a support team of activists that are also disrupting but in a legal way. So there's a role for everyone. Now, some people might think that we need 51% of the population to go vegan in order to create a vegan world. Well, we have good news and bad news.
The good news is we don't. Political scientist Erica Chenoweth's research on hundreds of previous social justice movements revealed what she calls the rule of 3.5%, whereby whenever 3.5% of a population were engaged in sustained, non-violent, direct action, that movement won every single time.
Now, statistics vary widely, and yet for argument's sake, say around 3.5%, give or take, of the populations of the UK, Australia, the United States, Israel and Germany are already vegan. However, none of them are the first vegan nations because not all of the roughly 3.5% of their respective vegan populations are engaged in sustained non-violent direct action.
In fact, it's estimated that only around 1% of all vegans are activists, and even less than 1% are engaged in sustained non-violent direct action. And this is the bad news. The solution to this is for all of us here to make sure we are active for animals, and more specifically involved in sustained non-violent direct action, and to encourage and inspire other people to also take part in sustained non-violent direct action.
As Gandhi said, you must be the change you wish to see in the world. If we want a vegan world, we must proactively create it. And if vegans don't take direct action for animals, then who will? We encourage everyone to put into practice what we've been talking about today and join us in London for the Animal Rebellion starting on the 7th of October. And there will be a non-violent direct action training for the rebellion later on today here at the camp out.
We're at a point in history where we can't just do what we personally prefer and what makes us feel comfortable. According to climate scientists, we're running out of time, and the animals desperately need us to step up and choose to do what's needed over what we personally prefer and feel comfortable with.
And this applies not only to direct action and other street activism, but also to online activism. We understand that some people don't feel comfortable dealing with the backlash that will most likely come when posting about animal rights content online.
In order to better deal with the backlash, we think it's important to keep perspective. Number one, some people are risking their freedoms and lives to go undercover and obtain footage. And number two, dealing with online backlash is nothing compared to what the animals are going through. They're in hell. What's worse, losing Facebook friends or animals losing their lives? So we need to keep doing what's needed for the actual victims, the animals, despite any backlash.
It's also important to remember that if you can't attend an action, the least we can do is share the work of activists online. Here's a short, empowering example of sharing and dealing with backlash from one of our followers.
I wanted to update you both. I just received a text from an old friend telling me that the things that I've been sharing on my Instagram story are making her want to give up meat. I started crying. I see now that changing the mind of someone is worth the backlash from the resistant people. Thank you for inspiring me to share my story with others.
Again, it's all about perspective. Online resistance is a good sign that your posts are speaking strongly for the animals and demanding change. You're pushing the envelope, and that will, of course, stir a reaction in people.
Agitation is a good thing. We want people to be agitated. Nothing changes without agitation. Without agitation, there is just stagnation and the status quo.
Our job as animal rights activists is not to make friends and not to make everybody feel comfortable. It's to speak strongly for the animal victims and demand serious change. Remember, we're not here to just rock the boat. We're here to sink the boat.
Animal rights activism is for the animals, and yet it also helps us as individuals. Activism is empowering. It helps vegans feel like they're doing more than just not contributing to the exploitation of and violence towards animals. We're literally taking action to help change things, and it counters the feelings of anguish, helplessness, and despair that many vegans feel overwhelmed by.
We're inspired by the words, I am no longer accepting the things I cannot change, I am changing the things I cannot accept. We are the ones we've been waiting for to create the change that's needed for animals and the planet.
And if it all gets too intense, remember, the wind blows hardest the closer you get to the mountaintop. And if you ever feel overwhelmed by the enormity of the task that we're facing, we find strength in the words of Nelson Mandela. It always seems impossible until it's done.
And it will be done. It has to be done in our lifetime because no evil can last forever. Every beginning has an end, and this is the beginning of the end of the animal exploiting empire.
But it's going to take each and every one of us to step up and take action for animals the same way we would want someone fighting for our lives if we were the victims.
And each one of us can do this. We must do this.
Because, as we always say, going vegan is not the most we can do.
It's the least we can do. Thank you. Thank you so much. That was beautiful.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.